Hey, extra historians, welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you all the things we left out, the stuff we got wrong, and why the Enlightenment could be kind of a bummer. I'm Rob, I'm the head writer of Extra History, and today we're talking about Frederick the Great. This was a really fun series to do. You all seem to really like it. Thank you so much for watching, and especially thank you to our patrons on Patreon. Lies is made possible by you, and I think that Lies is one of the most important aspects of the show because it shows us that history is a conversation and there are multiple perspectives and reveals why we made the choices we made. So thank you so much for letting us have this time together. If you want to watch the next episode of Extra History, so that is the John Brown series, it is up now on Nebula First. You can go watch it right now. Recommended reading for this series is Frederick the Great, A Military History by Dennis Showalter. This is going to tell you all the military aspects of Frederick's reign and all his innovations there, and get a bit in his head of his idea of command. Iron Kingdom, The Rise and Downfall of Prussia, 1600 to 1947 by Christopher Clark. This is all of Prussian history, so it actually jumps around a lot, weirdly, so you might have to hunt to get to the Frederick sections, but it's worth reading the entire thing. Frederick the Great, King of Prussia by Tim Blanning. This came out in 2016. It's fairly recent. And this is going to give you all the juicy personal details that you're after. Osprey has 3 books just on Frederick's army, Frederick the Great's Army 1, 2, and 3. Plus many on his individual battles. They are wonderful resources. Just generally, I want to talk about the difficulty of this series. We had to spend a lot of time in this series on military aspects, but I think actually if you go back and clock how much time we spent on specific things, we actually spent as much or more time talking about the reasons for Frederick's wars and his motivations for the wars and the diplomacy more than the actual fighting. I know it felt like there was a lot of war in this because there was a lot of war in Frederick's reign, but the difficulty wasn't necessarily the amount of war. It was that it was very intricate to discuss how he got into these conflicts and why he got into them. So that did frustrate me toward the end, where I'm like, oh, we're not going to have as much time for his domestic reigns, his domestic accomplishments. I'm not opposed to returning to Frederick, doing kind of a Frederick the Great Part B, where we talk about his specific domestic things, more of his later relationship with Maria Theresa. I also cut off that a little bit because maybe at some point we'll do a Partition of Poland series where we could get into that a little bit. But yeah, I don't know. This one did really well. Maybe we'll come back to him for a one-off or a two-off or maybe a short, like 3-episode series. I do want to talk about, I feel like sometimes Extra History gets into these rhythms where for a few months we'll have an accidental theme. So, for example, we kind of did history of East Asia a little while ago. And we've gotten into this accidental theme for the next 3 series, I feel like, which is the negative aspects of the Enlightenment, which is often something you don't hear about if you're just studying something in high school or even necessarily like an early college level. And the Enlightenment has a lot of bad things about it that are features, not bugs, right? And one of them with Frederick is that he does all this land reclamation. You know, he turns forest land into agricultural land. He kind of messes with the sandy soil of Prussia and makes it fruitful agriculturally. This is also a huge amount of environmental destruction. And again, this is a feature of the Enlightenment, not a bug. The Enlightenment idea is that mankind is going to go out and subjugate the natural forces of the world and turn it towards the production of food and housing, and it's going to civilize the natural world, right? And this is huge swaths of environmental destruction that Frederick is basically responsible for personally. He changes the landscape of what is now Germany. And I think that bears talking about. If we return to him, I would love to go into that more. I like environmental history just in general. And I feel like this theme of kind of like negative consequences of the Enlightenment is going to be carried forward in our John Brown series, And then especially in our Napoleon and Egypt series, it's real heavy there. So we have that to look forward to. Patron question from Hercules. I wonder if you could chime in, as within some LGBT circles, the trope of just good friends or just roommates makes it often come across as if historians are trying to downplay or even hide the fact that historical people had non-straight relationships. I think this is getting at something real, but like, I think this is more of a thing that is, 20 or 30 years ago was more prominent, or is more prominent with popular histories, like blockbuster biographies, necessarily in historians that are working in the academic sphere where, queer history is a burgeoning research topic. And a lot of the things that we know about queer history come from the academic research environment. So you do run into, in my opinion, a thing where the same way that people will say, like, this isn't getting covered in the media, and then they'll link some article in the media. It's like, well, you heard about this angle of the history probably due to an academic historian. So, it becomes a little bit of like a chicken and egg thing. But I definitely get where people are going with this. I think it is something that you run into sometimes with older professors, sometimes with older books. Because again, like in history, you're reading books sometimes that are written 20 or 30 years previously, where, there's more obfuscation. I think in the modern research environment, people would be more excited to find a queer history angle on a research subject because it hasn't been written to death. YouTube question. You actually forgot that in the Kata plot, Frederick's own mother tried to escape with him. I kind of read back and forth on this, whether she was aware of it and just kind of let it go past, or if she was hoping to join him too. I simplified the Kata plot just a lot in general, because it doesn't really get off the ground. Like, it is over before it begins. Like, someone rats him out, they know he's gonna run. He doesn't even manage to meet Kata. Like, they get taken in separate places. I do really want to point out that we didn't get too into how extreme the abuse was of Frederick, the physical abuse, because I felt like we got the point, and it might be overdoing it or triggering to some of our viewers to get too into like how extreme this could be. But after the Kata plot, like, Frederick William beats Frederick to the point where his mother thinks he's gonna die. Like, it's really, really extreme. There's another one that, again, I've heard back and forth on this. Some sources mention it, some don't. That, like, Frederick William grabs him by the hair and drags him across the room and strangles him with a curtain cord. Like, really bad stuff. Throwing dinner plates at people at dinner because he's in, Frederick William's in a wheelchair at that point and he can't get up to try and hit someone. And not just Frederick, like, Wilhelmine, like, throwing plates at her at dinner. He was a terrible guy, Frederick William. But I do want to mention, not in his defense, but this is just sort of an interesting thing. We really think of Frederick William as an autocrat and not being interested in Enlightenment ideals. He's actually more interested in meritocracy than Frederick himself is. His father promotes more commoners into the civil service and the army. Frederick is a little bit of an elitist, and that actually comes with, again, negative aspects of the Enlightenment, right? Like, to be an Enlightenment figure, to be an enlightened person, you need a certain kind of education, and you need to be able to afford things like the books you're supposed to read and things like that. The people who can afford them, especially at this period, are generally wealthier. They are middle class, they are aristocrats. So Frederick William, strangely enough, is better at meritocracy and egalitarianism in certain aspects than his son is, who often gets credit for being the more kind of like enlightened monarch. I did want to point out the Potsdam Giants, right? This unit, this platoon of giants that Frederick William has. They are not useful in combat. They're not useful on marches or even necessarily a lot in parades because they are so big, they are disabled. Like, we would probably say today that they have gigantism. We're talking about Andre the Giant, like, size people, not just like, oh, they're real tall. They're like, 6'3", 6'4". These are guys that they can't go on long marches because their feet start to develop fractures and things like that. They're, dying young and things like that. So this is totally a show unit. Like, it is not It is not a combat unit in any way whatsoever. It's all about showing off. Like, hey, here's a bunch of big dudes we put in uniforms. Episode 2, YouTube question. Frederick did himself recognize that he was adopting political strategies Machiavelli would agree with. He later wrote in his Political Testament, which is one of his books, I sadly have to concede that Machiavelli is right. Yeah, and actually it doesn't take very long. As the Anti-Machiavel is about to be published, Frederick becomes king, and his immediate thought is like, oh no. Because he realizes that he's going to have to do some pragmatic Machiavelli kind of stuff that he speaks out about, he speaks against in the Anti-Machiavel, and he actually tries to suppress its publication unsuccessfully. So he looks like a hypocrite real early in his reign when people are reading this book and being like, this isn't actually how he's acting. But yeah, there's all this stuff that we skipped over, but there's all this drama about him trying to pull the Anti-Machiavel because it's really politically inconvenient when it comes out. And he gets a little bit of flack for not living up to the tenets of his own book. In fact, he and Voltaire, this is later when Voltaire is living in Prussia, have a falling out largely over Frederick's very warlike, kind of warmongering tendencies. And they split for a while. They end up later corresponding, kind of patching things up, but they have issues. And Voltaire probably is the guy who puts out this book called The Private Life of Frederick the Great that makes all these salacious accusations about what Frederick gets up to at breakfast with young army officers, including stuff like, they have to be at breakfast naked, and then he throws his napkin at one of them, and that's who he's chosen for the day. You know, is real spicy stuff. All right, someone said, you gotta feel for Elizabeth Christine. She was treated more as a secretary by Frederick for most of his life than his queen, though he did at least try his best to make sure she got treated well, as that he could arrange, despite detesting her as someone he felt he was saddled with. Yeah, he provided for her, but he would have really taken political hits for not. Again, to be masculine at this time, you need to be in control of your household and providing for your household. And so for him to cut her off and just be like really financially stingy with her would have made him look really bad. But he is personally incredibly cold to her. He doesn't see her. Sometimes he'll see her like once a year on her birthday or his birthday. And famously at one point he's gone for a year, and his greeting to her when she comes in, having not seen him for a year, is, "Milady has grown fatter." Really awful kind of coldness and verbal abuse and just really gross stuff. He doesn't come off well. Why did he dislike her so much? He just seemed to have not liked women who were not in his own family. Like, except for his older sister and his mother, Frederick was incredibly dismissive of women, didn't like them, didn't like being around them. Strangely, he seems to have internalized a lot of the things that his father would say about France and about effeminate men and applied them to women in general. Again, like, something that would be interesting about his later reign is Frederick becomes a lot like his father with his family in his later reign. He's not physically abusive to that extent, but he's quite cruel and quite nasty to his own family and likes to interfere in their lives a lot. But yeah, poor Elizabeth Christine, she has no chance, because the whole family doesn't like her. Wilhelmine, the older sister, calls her, quote, as thick as two planks, and that's before she even really arrives in Prussia and is presented to Frederick. So she's just like walking in with a target painted on her back. You know, they just are constantly talking about how she's stupid and foolish, and it's really, you feel so bad for her. Seems like a very nice person. Someone pointed out the chessboard at 325 is set up incorrectly. Knights should be over near the castles at the edge, and Frederick should be as king, swapping places with the queen piece. Good eye. I do want to point out that this guy Algarati, who was likely Frederick's lover who comes to his coronation. Two things about him. Frederick's name for him is the Swan of Padua, which is very cool, very poetic, a little pet name. And He's a philosopher who specializes in science, and he basically writes physics for dummies, but it's physics for women. Like, here's how to explain physics to the women in your life. It's very silly. Frederick recently, just in the last few years, they discovered a poem between Frederick and Algarotti called The Orgasm, which you can go read. And I'm not going to read it because it's spicy. And I would turn just red all the way up to my hairline talking about Algarotti wallowing in pleasure. Actual quote. But seriously, we'll link it. It's worth a read. If you're like, I don't know, was Frederick gay? Yeah. Homoerotic humor was also a big thing apparently in Prussia at the time among men. I just want to say that Frederick's poor general at Molwitz, he's just absolute. Frederick never forgives him for winning that battle. And the poor guy just keeps trying to do as well as he can until he's killed at the Siege of Prague. Episode 3, patron question from Peanut Tree 5000. Is Charles of Lorraine, in this series, the general that Frederick is constantly beating, somewhat related to the Charles of Lorraine in the Siege of Vienna? This is the guy who he was wearing like rotting wigs and he was unkillable, like he got thrown off a bridge and survived. Even though they're separated by a large amount of time, are they related? Great question. Yes. Charles V of Lorraine, who fought in the 1683 Battle of Vienna, is Charles Alexander's grandfather, so there is a direct connection between these two. Patron question from Hercules. You mentioned in episode 3 that Prussia's greatest rival was Saxony, making it seem like Saxony was a minor, non-influential player in European politics. Except it wasn't. The Elector of Saxony, Frederick Augustus II, was also the ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Mostly I just wanted to say that Saxony wasn't a minor power. You're right about Saxony being linked with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but in Frederick's time it was Augustus II, not Frederick Augustus. It was Augustus III, pardon me, not Frederick Augustus II. Too many Fredericks and too many Augustuses. Frederick Augustus II came later. Poland was really in decline at this point. After the War of Polish Succession, I mean, it's on a terminal decline. It's only going to have one monarch after Augustus III. And it's not really considered a great power anymore. It's also geographically separated from Saxony. I do want to point out the one thing that Frederick, his big spoils of war from Saxony, other than impressing people into the army, is porcelain. Sweet, sweet porcelain. That he captures all this porcelain and takes it back to Potsdam. He loved porcelain. Someone said, man, this period in Europe was like a 50-player game of diplomacy where every move is war. Yeah, the 18th century is full of war, and that becomes a real problem because everyone starts to spend their entire treasury and then start to do things like tax their American colonies and have financial problems within their own countries that lead to revolutions. A bunch of people pointed out that Walpole was hanging around in this episode. He is actually the Prime Minister of Great Britain at this time. We do keep him a little longer than he actually was, and because I didn't want to switch from frame to frame and confuse people. But yep, he's kicking around during this time. He's influencing all of this diplomatic maneuvering. Episode 4, patron question from Mercury Rising. Empress Elizabeth at one point was open to a Prussian bride for her heir and trusted Frederick to evaluate the suitability of the future Catherine the Great. How did this relationship between the two break down afterwards? Diplomacy. Yep, all of this changing sides and things like that. It's also not unusual for to write to a monarch and say like, hey, can you check out this person we're thinking about marrying to my son. I mean, that would be mutually beneficial because maybe he would need to do that with a Russian bride at some point for someone in his family. YouTube question. With those opinions about Austrian Christianity, I'm surprised Frederick didn't try to ally himself with the Ottoman Empire. It's important to understand that his ribaldry and his denigration of religion, particularly Christianity, is private. But the reality is even weirder than an Ottoman alliance. He ends up becoming known as this great Protestant champion in Europe, which is just bizarre because he's such an outspoken atheist in private. But he becomes symbolic of the Protestant North standing up to the Catholic, Austrian South of the empire. So it's this dichotomy, and he ends up sheltering a bunch of Protestants, and he doesn't really care about religion all that much. In fact, there's a point where someone has, I forget if it's a cow or a sheep, someone has had sex with a piece of livestock, and they bring him to Frederick, and they're like, we're going to prosecute this guy, and he basically just makes a giant joke out of it and lets him go. So he doesn't really care about religious, even religious laws and what are considered religious crimes at the time. Someone said, I almost feels like a good thing to learn about Frederick's flaws at this point. When learning about history, I tend to make broad sweeps in people's moralities and not see them as complex and nuanced human beings. While I'm myself part of the LGBT community, and I love learning all sides of queer history, the hateful beliefs he harbored, more importantly enforced as an influential ruler, shouldn't be ignored. I like to say that there aren't heroes in history. There are people who take heroic actions. And the reason I say that is because it focuses you more on the idea that human beings are complicated. Like, history is the study of humans. And, anyone who's had to relate to, like, a parent or like a sibling can understand that people are complicated and they have good points and bad points. And people with power are even more complicated than that, because their decisions, even if they seem to be good, might have really negative consequences for a minority of their population or a large part of their population. So yeah, and Frederick is particularly scattershot. He's really all over the place in that, like, whoever you are and whatever you believe, you're going to like some things he did and you're going to hate some things he did. And if you're in the middle, you're probably going to be uncomfortable about a lot of his stuff. Everyone is complicated, and understanding that is really essential to studying history. I do want to point out, this is a time in history where you kind of have to make your battle plan before the battle and then just roll with it. Like, you can't get on a radio and tell units to reposition or break off contact and then, go do something else. You just kind of have to commit to what your plan is, and maybe you can throw reserves in here or there or tell your cavalry to do something. But there's no guarantee even your orders are going to be make it through or get interpreted correctly once combat is joined. So it's really sometimes thought of as this era of pure strategy, because you just have your plan and then you see if the plan works, and if it doesn't, well, that's it. It's also a time in Europe when armies are fighting on the same technological level with the same kind of units and the same type of equipment. And you've got your infantry and your grenadiers and your artillery and your cavalry, and it's kind of seen as a strategically pure period. I don't know if that's really true, but it's interesting. Episode 5, lots of really nice comments about the wrestling section. I just want to say that Nick is the genius behind every joke in that. I know nothing about professional wrestling. I know he's really into it, though, and that we'd get some cool stuff out of him for it. And also, battles are really hard for our artists to do, so I thought it would be a fun way to end a series that had been full of very difficult battle scenes. Someone mentioned the 7 Years' War lasted for 9 years. Why is it called the 7 Years' War? Well, the principal European conflict went on for 7 years, and it was a very Eurocentric time, so they're like, all that stuff going on in North America, whatever. Yeah, that might have gone on 2 years earlier, but it's really a 7 Years' War. So that's why. Coming up on Extra History, John Brown. This is going to be a really interesting series. It might change your opinion of John Brown if you think you know him. Certainly changed my opinion. It's fascinating. If you only learned about this out of a textbook, you're going to get a lot out of this series. Napoleon in Egypt, I've just finished writing these. They're being animated. It looks great. It's a really, really interesting thing. If you just think this is about the development of Egyptology, it's not. It's also about kind of laying the pattern for enlightenment-influenced governments intervening in the Middle East. It feels very contemporary. The Crimean War, again, talk about things feeling contemporary. This is the first modern war, the first one with war correspondence, and a lot of the supply lines and steamships and rail lines that we associate with what a modern war is. Also feels, you'll see, it got some parallels to what's going on today. And after that is your choice. Ibn Battuta's side trip. I want to talk about how Frederick influenced the early United States. The really famous example, of course, is that Frederick has this military aide named von Steuben. He's a baron. And he goes to the colonies during the American Revolution and ends up being a protege of George Washington and is the guy that basically teaches the Continental Army how to be an army on the Prussian model. He instills discipline. He tells them how to set up a camp so that their drinking water is not being contaminated by their poo water. How to dig latrines, how to do close order drill. And he's a really, really central part of the Continental Army and becomes the Inspector General with a rank equivalent to Major General. He is also very likely gay, much like many of the men we've talked about in this series. There is also a plot during the Articles of Confederation period. People really like Prussia in the US at this point because of von Steuben, because of Frederick having not allowed German allies of the British to cross his territory because he gets annoyed at the British during the later 7 Years' War, and they end up taking a long route to get to North America. But some people start talking about, we do really need a king. And who would be a great king? Is Frederick's younger brother, Prince Henry, who's undefeated in battle. We should invite that guy to come be our king, the King of America. Prince Henry, King of America. And of course, this doesn't go anywhere, obviously. There is actually a letter that Henry was aware of this and was like, yeah, that's all right. Maybe you want someone in France instead. But there is a third aspect to this, which is supposedly Frederick the Great sent George Washington a sword that is then passed to Washington's descendants. Well, not his descendants, but his family, because he doesn't have any children. This is actually a myth. There is a sword that people think up to the Civil War period is given to George Washington by Frederick the Great. It wasn't, but there is this thing that they think was passed on. And this is going to appear in our John Brown series. This sword plays a little bit of a minor role in Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. So take a look for that. How's that for a segue? Thanks so much. I'll see you next time when we talk about John Brown. Auf Wiedersehen.
What if I told you that Ahmed Ziad Turk, Angela Valenciana, Arclight Games, Casey Mustra, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blame, Kuya Koi, and Skylar Holmes were all legendary patrons? I'm not kidding.